With Britain leading the way on vaccinations, could this be the shot in the arm that Boris Johnson's premiership really needs? Effectively, the strategy to get out of COVID was always to suppress the virus and protect the elderly and the vulnerable. And in the vaccine rollout, we can see that the Prime Minister is desperately trying to achieve that aim. And I think he has actually put most of his eggs, if not all of them, in the vaccine basket. And what's been interesting about the Prime Minister's rhetoric of late is that it has been far less boosterish than it was last year. There was a period last year where COVID first hit, where the Prime Minister was first talking about things going back to normal by last Easter, then it was by summer, then it was by the autumn, then of course he made promises about a more normal Christmas that then had to be backtracked. So I think he's probably once bitten, twice shy when it comes to this idea of him over-promising and under-delivering. He's keeping his counsel because he is really desperately hoping that this rollout will work, and as a consequence we will be able to lift some of the restrictions that he personally finds it painful, frankly, to impose on the public. He's a libertarian, he doesn't want to impose these sorts of measures. He's often said no Prime Minister would want to do this, but I think we can all agree, particularly not one like Boris Johnson, who has always been a champion of people's individuals' freedoms. Success of the vaccine for him politically is so important. We've seen the government's response to coronavirus really quite heavily criticised. It was decided that hospital patients should be discharged into care homes without having had a test, and then that resulted in care homes accounting for 2/3 of the infections during the first wave. Mistakes like that, I think we can agree, are going to be reflected on very badly when it comes to a future public inquiry. So overall, I think the management of the crisis by the British state will come into scrutiny. Therefore, it's so important that there is that silver lining around what has been a very dark cloud. 100,000 deaths. The idea that the UK has got one of the worst death rates in the whole of Europe, if not the world, is going to hang heavily on Boris Johnson's administration. And so in order to try and find a way out of that, vaccines are key. And it's not just the fact that Oxford obviously have collaborated with AstraZeneca to come up with this scientific feat in producing the vaccine. It's also this idea that Britain is leading the world when it comes to vaccinating its population. And the numbers that we saw at the weekend, this idea that we have been able to vaccinate, I think in the last known count, 600,000 people in a day, almost amounts to 1% per population per day. Now, if you compare that to some of the countries in Europe, France, Germany, they have only managed to vaccinate 2% of the population so far. So we're streets ahead. I think we're now up to 11 to 12% of the population, and the rest of Europe is lagging very badly behind. So if we're some sort of leading light, then that tells the world two things. First of all, that the government's response hasn't been completely bungling and that we're ahead on vaccines, but also in the post-Brexit world, it celebrates this idea of Britain being a world leader when it comes to science and innovation. I'm not sure whether doing well in the vaccine rollout by itself is enough to make up for some of the government's mistakes in handling this pandemic. It's certainly a good start, and I think if he can meet those targets of vaccinating 15 million by mid-February and then moving on through the lower groups so that we get into a situation where all adults in the UK have been vaccinated by autumn, that will be a huge triumph, and I think the nation will be thanking Boris Johnson for that, and not least Kate Bingham, who runs the vaccine task force, and all of those involved. Now we're getting to a point where we have immunised those top vulnerable groups, and we're getting towards the next point of immunising most people classed as middle-aged or above. You're then going to get a very strong argument for a lot of this social distancing to end, and we're going to again see a repeat of the idea of sage scientists engaging in groupthink, holding the Prime Minister hostage. There are many Tory MPs who think that they've been using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and that a lot of these very draconian measures have come at the expense of the economy. Often people think that there needs to be a Labour opposition to the Prime Minister in order to keep him on his toes. But for Boris Johnson, the opposition again may come from within. It's always been more potent, frankly, for Prime Ministers, and we can think way back, but more recently, let's look at Theresa May and Boris Johnson. The opposition has been most dangerous when it's come from the Tory backbenches. If Tory backbenchers are going to make a fuss about the lifting of restrictions, the handling of the pandemic in the kind of post-vaccination future, the economy and the idea of trying to lower taxes rather than raise them, and you've also got issues around China and Huawei and other potential rebellions in the background, then that could be quite a problematic backdrop for Boris Johnson to navigate. Having said that, on the plus side for him, because he is an eternal optimist, and I think people have said that he hasn't handled the crisis well because he's a better good time Prime Minister than bad time Prime Minister, actually moving forward in the post-vaccination future to Britain's economic recovery, we will be seeing Boris Johnson play more to his strengths, because he is very much cast in the mould of someone who can go out and sell post-Brexit Britain. Equally, he's quite good at raising morale and making people feel more optimistic about the future.